Hi and welcome back to a new video. As you can see, judging by the title of this video, we are giving MinisForum a second chance. MinisForum is a vendor for these kind of mini PCs right here, and last year, pretty much a year ago, we were testing the HX90, which was also a mini PC. It was featuring an AMD mobile CPU and it was supposed to use liquid metal. Then it turned out that we were receiving like prototypes which were not using liquid metal. Then there were some weird things about the case material used and some like marketing terms they used online. And now we have the EliteMini B550 right here. This was already featured on Linus Tech Tips about a month ago, but we will check this out on a different perspective, not from does this even make sense, because I'm not sure about that in general. We will also talk about that, but I mainly want to see like how's the build quality, what do they promise online, is there anything going on weird with marketing, or are they now a trustworthy vendor? Now the EliteMini B550, as the name implies, is using AMD B550 chipset, which also means that we are expecting an AMD desktop socket inside. You can get this on different configurations. You can just get it bare without anything, like no CPU, no memory, no SSD. Then the pricing for this is about $320, which I think is a quite fair price. If you consider like building your own mini PC, then you would need a B550 board, you would need some kind of case, and you would need a PSU. And then you would end up in roughly the same price range, and this is quite compact, so definitely price performance wise nothing to complain about. The only negative point is the PSU. This PSU can deliver 120 watt, but the board itself, or like the PC, only supports 65 watt TDP CPUs. For example, the 5700G, which is an option you can select, and with the 5700G it costs about $600. Still, price performance wise, I would not complain about what you're getting. But then there is this argument about it has a desktop socket, so you can upgrade. But with the limitation of 65 watt TDP, I'm not quite sure if that's a valid argument or not. Because in the end, that's like, let's say, a 3700X, 5600X, 5700X CPUs. And let's say if we take a 5600X over a 5700G doesn't really make much sense because you're downgrading in cores. But if you switch from, let's say you start with this one, with the 5700G with an APU, like the graphics card sitting inside the CPU, and then you want to upgrade to the 5700X, it's like 10% best additional performance. And speaking in several years, that's probably not going to be relevant. So upgrading, or like the upgrading argument, is something I don't really see. You can configure it the way you need it if you want to. You can like partially build it yourself, but upgrading, I think it's not really that relevant. I'm also not quite sure what happens if you plug in higher rated CPUs like a 5950X, 5900X with higher TDP. Would be quite interesting. Maybe we will try that to see if it's just not fully utilizing the speed, like downclocking, or if it won't post at all. One thing that definitely sets apart this mini PC from all the others you can find online is this external graphics card dock, which you can use to plug in the mini PC next to it over this slot right here, and then connect an external GPU to it. The external dock does not come assembled, so you have to assemble it yourself. Totally fine, it's also fun to do. Quality of the parts, like the metal sheet parts and like even the acrylic parts and everything, is pretty good. So that is quite nice. I just don't get why you cannot buy this separately, because this is pretty much a bit like a docking station you would have for your notebook, for example. So if you were thinking about like you could carry this around and have it like at home and at work, you would need two of these. On the mini PC itself, we have this discrete graphics card interface cover, which we first have to remove. And underneath the cover, it just looks like the mini PC just turned into a X16 PCIe graphics card. Now you simply slide this into the dock. We still have to add some screws on the side right here, but then this is making a nice bench table, I would say. Now, if you want to use it with the external graphics card, then you also have to use an external PSU. You cannot rely on the 120 watt PSU that's included, so you have to use an external one, like this one, just a normal ATX or like an SFX PSU. There usually is also an additional like PSU shroud included, so it's an additional bracket that goes behind here where you can place, for example, an ATX power supply. Pretty much like this, or rotate it like this next to it. Anyway, so the thing is, you have to put your PSU next to it, and then you have to connect it with the mini PC and also with the graphics card dock. On the bottom, you have a 24-pin connector, which you have to connect to the PSU. There is this cable here included to do so, but the thing is, yeah, not every PSU has the same cable or even the same pinout. For example, on this Seasonic PSU right here, the 24-pin cable is even like split up into 2 connectors, so this will not work. You will have to use the connector that's included in the PSU. That's not really a problem, but something I'm just not sure why they included this, because this might not work for a ton of PSUs. Then you have this 10-pin connector in here. There's this cable included for that. The cable goes from the bottom into the 10-pin, and then you have an additional EPS 4-pin connector that just gets power from the PSU directly. By the way, when I just did more research about this product and other reviews, I found out that MinisForum decided not to include this in the retail packaging, so just forget about everything that I said earlier about the 24-pin cable. Sheik just pointed me towards something very important regarding the cable of this Seasonic PSU. I'm not sure if that's just because it's a Seasonic PSU and maybe there's a standard and they're not following it, but check out this notch right here. Now if you try to plug it in here, you might notice that it's not going to fit. I'm not quite sure why they made this cutout so small, but yeah, this PSU will not fit. One more thing I don't understand is why there is this like artificial GPU limit. They made this like a notch or like L bend right here, which is definitely to give this steel sheet here a bit more stability, but at the same time it's artificially limiting the width of your GPU, because you can only go for dual slots and only for, I think it's like 54 millimeters right here. But apart from that, I mean, I don't see why you should not be allowed or able to plug like a 3-slot card, for example. Yeah, they should have found a better solution not to limit this. One of the main issues we had with the HX90 were the marketing claims. So we will quickly go over the MinisForum website with the EliteMini B550. And generally speaking, this has much less marketing terms than the HX90 had. Everything is a lot more technical, which is something I totally approve. So from my side, first impression is very good. I'm not going to talk about the fact that the CPU that is used in the render right here is actually an Intel CPU, like an 115X CPU, which is LGA, and they're putting it into a PGA socket, so that doesn't really make much sense, but it's still a render and probably doesn't matter. Also the render about the GPU dock, it actually looks like the GPU is colliding there, but yeah, okay, let's neglect that for a second. The only thing that I could find was that they're advertising quad 4K displays, but then this only has dual HDMI and a single display port, so I'm not quite sure how they are going to use quad 4K with this, because also the Type-C is not featuring like the DisplayPort alt mode. So yeah, I'm not quite sure if that's like a copy-paste mistake that they're putting quad 4K on there, because that's definitely not the case. I also investigated some of the performance claims they had, at least I was double checking with GTA 5 and PUBG FPS wise, and I can confirm that this is absolutely legit. So the FPS they were claiming on the website with PUBG actually even had a bit higher FPS on there, and GTA 5 was absolutely on point. So that is all correct. Nothing to complain about except for maybe this typo with quad 4K. But before we continue with the full assembly, we will disassemble it first and check how the internals are built, how the build quality is inside. Underneath the backside we have the options to upgrade, because this is also the version that comes with an SSD, memory and a CPU pre-installed. But apart from that, you can also install an additional 2.5-inch SSD, that's the cable for it. We have a Wi-Fi module in the corner and also the possibility to add a second M.2 drive if you run out of space later. One thing I like is that if you pick the option with the SSD included, you will even get a heatsink on it. The case itself looks very high quality, I really like it. It also doesn't have any kind of liquid metal spills this time, so that's a good improvement. Also, if you disassemble this, I strongly recommend that you just take out the Wi-Fi module itself instead of just taking out the antennas. Will make your life a lot easier, but yeah, nothing to complain about so far. The mainboard itself and the layout is also very interesting, just by the fact that you have this PCIe interface on the side. We have an 80mm fan with the heatsink. If you want to disassemble the heatsink, you have to also dismantle or like remove the entire backplate. First of all, the 2.5-inch adapter plate, and then the backplate to remove the heatsink. Those are the memory sticks that are included, like if you take the bundle option, and those should be 3200 megahertz sticks from what I can tell. By the way, is this normal or is my cat broken? Right now I'm running some Cinebench R20 for some basic testing for power consumption, temperatures and also noise level. You cannot hear everything. The fan is absolutely quiet. That is really great. Power consumption wise, you could see that the peak power draw on the CPU was about 80 watt. And even with that, the peak temperature is below 70 degrees Celsius. So there is definitely headroom for more power draw. Let's say even if you would run a 5900X, especially in gaming, it would probably draw about the same power as what we can see right here with the 5700G. So yeah, I guess there is actually headroom for a stronger CPU, both for cooling and power delivery wise. The score is absolutely in line though. Of course, we want to know what happens if we plug a higher grade CPU, like a 5900X for example, into the socket. Luckily, the AMD 5700G already automatically removed itself from the socket by still being stuck to the heatsink. I mean, yeah, I'm very glad that AMD finally moves to LGA socket very soon. But just looking at the heatsink, you will also notice that this is not following the normal AM4 mounting dimensions, which means that you will always be stuck to use this heatsink. Even just by looking at the dimensions, what you have inside the case and on here, it almost looks like you could have used one of these tiny Noctua cooling fans or cooling heatsinks. Apart from that, we have some smaller passive looking heatsinks on there, which will be cooled also by the fan on the heatsink above. This one is cooling the chipset, and then two tinier ones for the MOSFETs of the power stages. I just found a quite huge dent inside the heatsink cold plate while removing the thermal paste. And now you could definitely start complaining about this, but I also want to point out that just from a thermal point of view, there is nothing to complain about. This will not affect your performance at all. You will not be able to tell or even measure any kind of difference by this. The thermal paste will take care of it. So yeah, and that's why I'm not going to complain about it, because technically it just doesn't make a difference. The question I'm asking myself is, what happens if we transition to the external PSU? Because it makes absolute sense that you're limiting the power draw while you're using the external power brick, if it's only able to provide 120 watt of total system power, and then you're limiting the CPU itself to 65 watt. Makes absolute sense. The VRMs on the board could be an additional limiting factor. It looks like it's just 4 stages purely for CPU V-core, so it's definitely not too much. They're cooled with heatsinks, so should give us a bit more headroom, I guess. Maybe 80 to 100 watt power draw would be possible. That's why we will try what happens with the 5950X, if we can get it to work or to boot, and what kind of temperatures would we see with the external PSU. So that's something I definitely want to find out. I also want to highlight that online on the MinisForum website, they pointed out that if you want to use, for example, a 5700X, then you might have to downgrade your memory speed. They were pointing out that if you run a 5700X, then you can only run 66 MHz on the memory dual channel or single channel 3200. So that's definitely a difference to running the 5700G. After checking some of my other PSUs, like the different Seasonic PSUs have this big notch, and also, for example, the Corsair AX1600i, which I'm typically using for my testing. Yeah, which means I will just cut this off and then plug it in. Should be the easiest solution for now. I'm using the entire thing just open, no case, nothing screwed on there, simply because if it doesn't work out, then it will save me some time to replace the CPU back to the 5700G. But now, let's see if this, no, that's the reset button. Let's check if this works. After about 2 minutes, still no boot. Not sure if some BIOS reset can help to fix it. Otherwise, I might have to change to maybe a single channel memory configuration first, and if that doesn't help, maybe also change to different DIMMs, because those are 3200, and if you just plug 2666, it initially might train lower and then could be easier for it to boot. Even with single channel different memory sticks, so far no success. Just every single time. And now you might say, you just have to twist the heatsink to get it off easier. I would love to twist the heatsink, but you see those like little notches, they go directly into these holes and you cannot twist anything. Now trying the same thing again, but single channel and with a 3900X, simply because it's one generation older, might be easier for the board to post, not sure, we will find out. The system was so quick to post that I couldn't even plug in the keyboard, but you can see the 3900X detected and no problems whatsoever, running all right clock speeds from what I can tell. But right now it's single channel memory with 2666, simply because I didn't enter the BIOS. But let's just see what it does with Cinebench. I was about to say that's not bad, but then I just lost display signal. Damn it. Okay, so that's the German take I just did. I will just talk about what I was seeing in the German part. First of all, I was quite impressed that it was easily drawing like 115 watt on the CPU. Also, the clock speed looked quite fine, so about 3.5 to 3.6 gigahertz. And also the temperature was quite nice, so about 70, maybe mid 70s, considering that it's a quite tiny heatsink. That was far better than I expected, so not quite sure why it just shut down, if it was temperature protection of maybe the VRM. Maybe just go to the BIOS and find out. The BIOS is not even bad. Now also running 32 GB of memory, 2666 right now. You have a ton of features you can set, not sure if everything works, but for example, hardware monitor, you can set your fan profile, like fan curve. You can see it starts at fan speed of 40 degrees Celsius. And then it's also set to run full speed only at 95 degrees Celsius. That seems to be quite high, not quite sure if that's with some sort of offset or not. Also, if you just see right on top, it's listing system temperature, probably like chipset, with 255 and CPU temperature with 255. So something seems to be not 100% working on here, but maybe in AMD overclocking menu, we can find some limits we can disable if this was some sort of like OCP. There wasn't really anything. Maybe let's just try if PBO helps. Not really sure if it will help. I set some manual values which are quite close to what you typically have AMD stock-wise for like 105 watt CPU. And now also attached a temperature probe on the back side simply to check the VRM temperature, and that's pretty much the idle temperature after being in the BIOS for like 10 minutes. I spent a lot more time testing, and yeah, it's just a typical BIOS issue from what I can tell. Like thermally and also from the VRM, I don't see why it would shut down. I was never able to complete a full R20 run. Even just installing Ryzen Master is not even possible because it always keeps crashing. So it seems to have some weird stability issues. I would say that it's probably related to memory frequency or like memory settings, but you cannot change anything. It's the same as with the power settings we just did with like AMD overclocking submenu, like PBO. Those settings were never applied. Even though I did them in the BIOS, like if I changed anything in there, it just wouldn't post anymore. And it's the same for changing memory frequency. I tried to like boot 2133 or 2400 to make it a little bit easier on the memory controller, for example, or like ease in timings. Nothing worked. Like whenever you touch anything in the BIOS, it just won't post. And that's a bit of waste potential, unfortunately, because just from when I get R20 to start, the VRM peaked out, like the highest I saw was 72 degrees Celsius. And that is far from being like in any red zone. Same goes for the cooler, like CPU temperature was never an issue, so I don't see that this was the limitation. And it's a bit of a wasted potential to not be able to run a higher grade CPU in there, because this pretty much kills the entire being upgradable argument. In the Linus Tech Tips video, they said that they were able to post with the 5800X, and they also had some issues with not being able to run full clock speed. So there seems to be some kind of issue, and definitely it would be great if MinisForum would spend a bit more time on the BIOS, do some adjustments there, because I don't see why it wouldn't handle like a 5900X or like a 5950X. You can still like limit this in power consumption if you configure your BIOS correctly. You should be able to run a 16 core, maybe limit it to 80 or 90 watt power draw, but then you can still utilize the cores. So rendering power should still be better and there. But with the 5950X, we were never able to post at all. With the 3900X it worked, but it seems to have a lot of stability issues. So yeah, there's no way for me, or like no point continue testing if nothing you try in the BIOS can be applied. That is a problem. Apart from that, the build quality, if you just buy this as a mini PC with the 5700G, seems to be a very solid product, very well engineered. The cooling is great, like everything inside is very easy also to access. So it's in theory easy to upgrade, but I would kind of like neglect the CPU on there because like right now in this state, it just doesn't make sense to upgrade the CPU. You can definitely get it, and with the 5700G, if you want to run a mini PC with the iGPU, it makes sense. But with the entire dock thing, I'm not quite sure, because in my opinion, if you have a dock and you run external power, then you should also be able to draw more power and run a higher grade CPU, but that's something that's missing on here. But that could be something that MinisForum can still work on, even though it's already out. With the BIOS update, they might be able to improve these things. That's something I would like to see. Apart from that, just retrospectively looking 1 year back and comparing how MinisForum is acting now, like the communication is very well, like everything they're putting on the website, besides some of these like small mistakes on the website. But to be fully honest, if I look at my own website, I also have probably a ton of mistakes there, so not a big deal in my eye. There are some weird things they should maybe fix though, like if I scroll over the website, there are some placeholders for like empty articles, like picture placeholders and stuff, which are a bit weird. It doesn't give you like a very professional impression. So that's something you can maybe fix. Shouldn't be a lot of work to maybe remove that part entirely. And then from my perspective, it's a good improvement they made over the previous year, and definitely something you can recommend. Like the build quality and everything is fine if you get the 5700G. Using it with different CPUs, not quite sure. Yeah, so far about an update for MinisForum. I think it's very important that if we have a product or like a company that stood out negatively in the past, we also have to like recheck, because some of them are trying to improve, and if they improved, it's definitely also worth and also fair to give them an update. And from my opinion, they definitely improved. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time. Bye bye.